Well, thank you very much. I'd like to start off by saying my name is Richard Longstaff. I'm a managing director with Deloitte. And it's been a great morning so far. There's been some wonderful speakers, and I'm particularly excited for this panel because after hearing the learned and earnest opinions of many people this morning, we finally get to hear from the people who dig the rocks out of the ground and the people who finance digging the rocks out of the ground, which I think is going to be very exciting. My thanks to SAFE. I would like to say that in January 2025, SAFE produced a fascinating report called Resources for Resources Financing Critical Mineral Supply Chains. And that showed that right now the United States is in a simultaneous moment of threat, opportunity, and change for critical minerals. A threat because insecure critical mineral supply chains dominated by malign actors have the potential to limit our access to the minerals needed for the United States to maintain its leadership in the defense, energy, and technology fields. It's an opportunity because, finally, the US public and private sectors are now highly focused on the critical minerals issues, and this means that new ideas and market-based solutions are being developed, discussed, and most importantly, now being put into action. And change because in order to take advantage of those opportunities and mitigate those threats, it's clear that the US mineral strategy needs to go through a transformation, and that transformation can't start a few years from now. It has to start now, and indeed, it is starting now. And so, what kind of changes are already happening? What can we learn from them? And how do we see things continuing to develop over the short to medium term? To answer these questions, Deloitte is delighted to host this panel, comprised of three key public and private leaders in the mining and mineral sector, who are going to shed some light on how they think the industry is changing and how they see it continuing to change over the next few years. Pat Risner is the president of South 32 Hermosa, which is currently the only advanced mine development project in the United States that could produce two federally designated critical minerals, manganese and zinc. With over 30 years of mining industry experience, he has held executive global roles in operations, project development, health, safety, and environment in Australia and the US. Sarah Whitten is the Senior Vice President for China and Transformational Export Program at the Export-Import Bank of the United States, the US government's Export Credit Agency. With a career spanning Tokyo, Chicago, New York, Johannesburg, and now Washington, D.C., Sarah spearheads initiatives to bolster US leadership in strategic sectors like battery storage, semiconductors, and critical minerals. And Eric Norris is Executive Vice President and Chief Commercial Officer for Albemarle Corporation, the global leader in transforming lithium and bromine into critical ingredients for mobility, energy, connectivity, and health. And Eric joined Albemarle in January 2018 as Chief Strategy Officer. So if I can, I'm going to start with Pat. So Pat, South 32's $2 billion investment in South Arizona to develop the Hermosa zinc-lead-silver deposit is the first critical minerals mining project added to the US FAST-41 permitting process. It also has the potential to be one of the world's largest zinc producers. Given the trailblazing nature of the project, could you share some of South 32's lessons from the permitting process generally and FAST-41? What project or development-related issues were bigger hurdles for you than anticipated, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, thank you. It's an exciting development. We're really feel quite fortunate to be part of one of the only mining projects, large mining projects, that's fully permitted for both construction and operations and fully funded. So our board made a decision a little over a year ago, last February, to invest $2.2 billion to get the project into first production by early 2027. So just a little bit of context, we have one of the largest undeveloped zinc deposits in the world. Zinc was added to the critical minerals list in 2022. And then we have co-located a large high-purity manganese deposit that is suitable for the lithium-ion battery supply chain and potentially the only fully integrated source of manganese for that industry. And so the project's fully permitted mainly because we've started to develop the project on private land. So we had an opportunity with a private land base to design a project where we could build the project, get to first production, ramp up to full production from private land on a state permitting regime. I think Arizona is a very attractive jurisdiction from that standpoint, very efficient permitting. But as with most mining projects, there is almost always a federal nexus of some sort. We're surrounded by Coronado National Forest, so we have ancillary infrastructure, roads, power lines, other things that do require a NEPA or a federal permitting process. So while we're in construction, the project's about 40% complete. We're about 40% into that capital expenditure program. The federal permitting process that has been a challenge for many years in getting these large projects into operation has been one where we've taken a slightly different approach. So we were approached about being the first project into Fast 41 in 2023. It's been a covered sector since 2020, but no project has been a part of the program. I think probably one of the key lessons is this can work. It's going very well for us. We started the process a little over a year ago. We'll have a draft environmental impact statement in May. That's 1 year from the start of the process, and we are on track for a decision July of next year, which will be just over 2 years. We all know that process takes 6, 7, 10 plus years. We've got projects in the industry that have been at it for more than a decade. So the role of the Permitting Council and an independent federal agency that has oversight of the program that helps really address a lot of the administrative delays that have had in the process, that transparency in the schedule, the accountability and resourcing, it really is working. And so we think, as we think about permitting reform, there's a lot to learn from that. But I think the key lessons are, while that fixes permitting process, there's two other elements that I think are critically important, because many of these projects have really been held up more by social license and community challenges, tribal concerns. While it looks like a permitting delay, it's grounded in social license issues. So I think recognizing that there has to be shared value, that you have to secure a social license, being very proactive with stakeholders like tribes. We started engaging 12 different tribes about 4 years before we even started a permitting process, understanding your cultural and environmental context and involving them in decisions, design, planning, things like that. And then the last thing I would touch on is we have to transform and think about doing things differently. Part of why we got into Fast 41, criticality of the supply chains. These are two critical minerals we're highly reliant. All the battery grade manganese in the world comes from China. 94% of the zinc in the world is mined outside the US. So that's compelling, but at the end of the day, we had to do some things differently. So we've designed the mine to be a small footprint, minimize surface disturbance, about 95% reduction in surface impacts, 90% less water use, use of battery electric fleets, things like that. So securing that social license, because it takes a collective will from local government, communities, tribes, federal government, and internal stakeholders to get something like this done and moving forward.
Well, that's fabulous. And you mentioned the role of various levels of government. I mean, let's talk to Sarah now. Sarah, for those in the room who maybe are not intimately familiar, maybe you can give us kind of the 101 of EXIM Bank and what its role is internationally and both domestically here in the United States.
Sure, Richard, very happy to. And maybe before delving into the EXIM of today, I can start with the EXIM of the past. We've been supporting US businesses for 91 years. EXIM started in 1934. President Franklin D. Roosevelt commissioned EXIM to lift America out of the Great Depression by growing US jobs through exports. So that was really our genesis. And since EXIM's first deal, which was a $3.8 million loan to Cuba for silver ingots, EXIM has been facilitating global trade, helping US businesses expand and sustain jobs through international opportunities. Today, EXIM drives economic growth, and I just want to make sure I get the statistics right. We've done over $66 billion in support to more than 5,000 US businesses over the last decade. In the last fiscal year alone, we backed 1,400 transactions, supported 38,000 jobs in the United States, and returned $80 million to the US Treasury. Under its current congressional authority, which we are looking to go into reauthorization, we have approximately $100 billion left to spend and new deals left to do. So really excited to be leaning into this critical minerals sector. As I mentioned, we are the export credit agency of the United States government. And so we've got certain financing tools. All of them are very much debt focused. Everything from direct loans, loan guarantees, export credit insurance, all to help US companies secure access to emerging markets where they may initially be hesitant to enter into these markets due to perceived risk. We also have the China and Transformational Exports Program, or the CTEP program, which I lead. And this is a congressionally mandated program to help support US industries in nascent technology sectors that are critical to America's national security, spanning everything from wireless communications, battery storage, and critical minerals, of course. And the way that we work with the rest of the organization is we provide flexibilities to EXIM's traditional financing tools to ensure that American companies can compete better with heavily subsidized foreign firms, particularly from the People's Republic of China. And our portfolio, therefore, puts geopolitical and national security considerations really at the center of what we do. The one thing I wanted to just make reference to that Deloitte had actually conducted in the fall of last year was the annual CEO survey. And over half of CEOs identified geopolitics as the #1 concern going into the new year. And I think that's evident as we've gone 10 weeks into the new administration as well. The fact that geopolitics is increasingly front and center for global decision makers is very clear. And this impacts everything from shifting supply chains, which a lot of these panels have been talking about, to technology competition. Obviously, this year alone, we've seen 2 export bans from China on critical minerals as well, which impacts everything from tech manufacturing to defense goods. So at a time when global competition is fiercer more than ever, EXIM's not just a bank, it's a strategic tool that strengthens America's economic power, fuels growth, and helps support American companies looking to enter into global trade.
Thank you. I actually, one of the things that fascinates me about EXIM was I was up at PDAC in Toronto last month. And normally when you go to PDAC, you wander around the corridors and you look for the various meeting rooms that are like packed to the rafters, because those are the ones that have the most interesting meetings. And normally it would be somebody like Albemarle or somebody like South 32 or Tech. And there was one room that was absolutely jammed to capacity, which I had to force my way into. And there was somebody on the stage from EXIM Bank, which kind of took me back at the time. I hadn't anticipated that. And they talked about a thing called the Supply Chain Resiliency Initiative. There was a lot of enthusiasm at PDAC for this. Maybe you could give people an overview of this, which seems like it's starting to resonate with the industry right now.
Sure, thank you, and so glad to hear that you heard it firsthand. That was probably the 3rd conference that our team had attended to really socialize the Supply Chain Resiliency Initiative. And this is a completely new financing mechanism that was approved by our board in January of this year. We had the opportunity to attend Mining Indaba, the BMO conference, and most recently the PDAC conference in Toronto. As we're all very well aware, the US relies so heavily on critical minerals imports. And this is essential for all of the industries I mentioned earlier that we cover under the CTEP portfolio and that Congress has asked EXIM to look at. So it was really important for us to go further upstream and really help develop some of these critical minerals opportunities. But what came to light when we were discussing with the industry was that there was really a gap in our toolkit and in the financing mechanisms needed to bring these mines on board. As the Export Credit Agency of the US, our funding mechanisms traditionally have been very much tied to exports, if you're looking from a US looking outward perspective, of US goods and services into these projects globally. Now, if you're a mine in Africa or South America, the likelihood of getting a high percentage of US content into those transactions, and I'm not just talking about procuring Caterpillar goods or, and even Caterpillar goods, not a lot of that is manufactured domestically anymore because of the globalized nature of supply chains. It made it challenging for us to engage with the industry. And so what we realized is that we really needed to support a financing mechanism that looks at things from a different perspective, that considers the imports of the offtake to the United States as opposed to the exports of the equipment into the project. And so that was our thinking around the supply chain resiliency initiative. And so, of course, we would love to continue, and we will continue to incentivize U.S. equipment purchases into these projects. But under the supply chain resiliency initiative, we would be able to support up to the amount, from a financing perspective, up to the amount of offtake, new offtake, that is going to the United States. And so this really helps, considering things like I mentioned earlier about export bans that we've been facing this year in the United States. It just really highlights the issues of relying too heavily as an industry on the OEM side, the manufacturing side, on inputs that are coming from a single source that can use those levers to delay or even halt supply chains. And so this is really, coming at it from not just the national security angle, which is obviously very important, but to also help expedite and catalyze these mines, and when they're making their offtake decisions, moving some of those supply chains back to the United States. I'd like to also maybe just add one last point to my comment here, which is we also have a domestic financing program, which is called the Make More in America program. And this has been in place for just over 2 years now. And so we really see those two financing mechanisms to be complementary. The SCRI supports global mining projects that are providing offtake to the United States. Our existing Make More in America program can support domestic midstream refining and manufacturing projects that utilize these critical minerals. And just last week, our board approved a deal for a small to medium-sized company by the name of Hyperion X that processes titanium. Earlier this year, we had also supported a business in Tennessee called Amero, which uses niobium and produces advanced materials used for a lot of these strategic sectors. And so we're really excited that we've got both of these tools, and actually both of these tools were also mentioned in the recent executive order that came out about 2 weeks ago on minerals production in the United States, and maybe we could talk about that later as well.
That would be great, and in fact, I love the way the conversation is progressing from the upstream starting to go to downstream, Eric, which kind of is going to bring me to you. So the Western Hemisphere generally, North America in particular, is some of the most significant lithium deposits in the world. But it's notable that most lithium processing, about 65% of it, happens in China. China has about 20% of the world's lithium deposits. How do we change that equation? What are the key things that need to be done? And you're not allowed to repeat everything that Sarah said about EXIM Bank. But what are the key things that need to be done to scale up not just the extraction of the rocks out of the ground, but also the downstream processing into commodities and products? Should we consider mining and processing as two separate industries, or are they the same side of the same coin? And if they're the same side of the same coin, then how do we use that complementarity to accelerate the growth of the industry versus letting it be being a complexity that will slow things down?
Well, sure. Thank you, Richard, and thank you to SAFE for having me here. It's a pleasure to talk about critical minerals broadly and lithium specifically. Maybe to put a context around that question for the audience, we'll talk a lot about what's critical. Lithium has no effective substitute for what it does, and its uses in transportation, in defense, in grid storage, and a whole host of industrial and health applications is broad. In the United States alone, demand is expected in the next 5 years to grow 300% for lithium between now and the end of the decade. So that puts some context around it, and also some context around, as Sarah referenced, the executive order from the president around its importance and the emergency around developing that supply chain. You point out rightly, it is not a resource problem when you talk about what's available here in North America. We know that as a company, we've been operating, we're the only mine-to-market operator currently producing from the ground to product that goes into batteries, lithium here in the United States. It's a small operation based on brine. Around the world, we do that in rock operations in Australia in 2 separate resources, and we're developing the Kings Mountain mine, redeveloping, I should say, for many decades after World War II it was used. We're redeveloping that mine, and it's a top quartile resource. It's one of the many that you referenced throughout North America that provide an abundance of strong resources that are, and it's an important concept I'm going to say, are in the money today at those top quartile resources. The challenge as we go downstream is that operation is not in the money. It is the more capital-intensive operation, the process. We'll use a term in our industry called conversion. Some will use midstreaming. It's basically taking the process ore and converting it into a usable salt that goes into the cathode of a battery. That process, particularly for hard rock, which is the most abundant resource in the world and the greatest opportunity here in the U.S., is that know-how is concentrated in very few hands. There is only really one demonstration of that plant of such an operation being successful outside in the Western world, I'll say. That's our operation in Western Australia, Kemerton. We had intended to take that sort of supply chain, which is one based on a world-class resource in Western Australia, coupled with a downstream processing, to the United States. And that pivot, as a leadership team, our CEO started that pivot several years ago. And we are midstream when we've seen a pretty significant drop in the price of lithium to levels that render that activity not economic. And so that's the challenge. I mean, I do not believe that there's a world of sense in separating mining from conversion. That does happen in parts of the world. When we're at a very early stage of trying to build that supply chain, which again, the administration is very focused on building, it's going to take people who have the operating skills, and Albemarle, we have that. We have a shovel-ready project that is ready to go, and it's going to take the support financially to make that happen. Well, it's going to take the development of a Western reference price for that material to develop, to support economic production here. And very often that know-how is coupled with some know-how of the resource specifics and the integration of the two. There's some benefits in. So I think to mitigate risks and to maximize success, there's a benefit in having some integration there. I think what it is going to take, and why this discussion and many of the discussions that led up to this morning, is going to take a very novel approach in terms of government policy and public-private partnerships to make it happen. And we're seeing that happen in other parts of the world as we speak.
Okay. I mean, that's fascinating that the need for support from the public sector isn't just about supply and demand. There's many other factors as well, which, Pat, maybe one of the things I can come back to you on, is looking at some of the plans